At Thanksgiving, my mother raised her glass like she always did when she wanted the whole room to look at my sister. "Brielle's wedding was beautiful," she said, smiling wide. "So Michael, when's yours?" I felt something snap clean inside me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I just said, "Had mine. 6 months ago. You got the invitations." The laughter died instantly. My father set down his fork like it suddenly weighed 100 pounds. "We never got them," he whispered. That's when I reached into my jacket, pulled out the delivery receipts, and slid them onto the table. All 4 envelopes, all signed for, same handwriting, same name. And in that moment, watching my family freeze in the truth they built themselves around, I realized I finally knew exactly who made sure my wedding never existed to them. And why. Before I share my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you are. I love hearing how far my story reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And before we dive in, if you want more true family stories told honestly, gently, and without filters, feel free to subscribe. It helps more than you know. My name is Michael Holt, and this is the night I learned the truth about my own family. I guess the only way to start this is by telling you who I am now, not who I used to be. My name is Michael Holt, and I haven't lived in Charleston for years. I left that city the moment I realized I could no longer breathe in a house where silence had sharper edges than words. But memories have a way of staying behind your ribs even when the rest of you manages to escape. Whenever Charleston comes to mind, it appears like an old photograph, warm lighting, polished floors, and people who smile for the camera, while ignoring the truth standing just outside the frame. Growing up in the Holt family felt less like being part of a home and more like watching one. Brielle, my older sister, was the center of every room long before she learned to walk in heels. My mother treated her like a lifetime project, grooming her for Southern society events as if preparing her for a stage. Every Saturday morning meant dance rehearsals, hair appointments, fittings, and rehearsals for whatever spotlight awaited Brielle next. I remember watching her twirl on polished hardwood floors, dress swishing like a flag signaling the family's pride. And then there was me, quiet, careful, standing just far enough away so I wouldn't ruin the picture. My mother, Margot Holt, managed the family's image with the intensity of someone running a political campaign. Every word was monitored. Every photo was retaken until Brielle looked perfect. My father, Dennis, kept himself tucked behind a newspaper or a glass of iced tea, nodding gently, avoiding anything resembling confrontation. And when I was overlooked or dismissed entirely, he simply pretended not to see. Favoritism wasn't a secret in my house. It was a blueprint. My achievements were acknowledged only if they could fit neatly behind Brielle's. When I won a National Science Award, my mother asked if I could wait to take pictures because the lighting was better for Brielle's new portrait. I stood there holding my certificate, smiling a smile that wasn't real, realizing for the first time that in my own family I wasn't meant to shine. I was meant to support the one who did. You'd think a child might rebel. I didn't. I internalized it. I became quiet, useful, predictable. I learned the art of taking up as little emotional space as possible. After years of living behind Brielle's spotlight, I understood that if I wanted to be seen at all, I'd have to look for that visibility somewhere else. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. It was a slow accumulation of moments, dinners where no one asked me a single question, holidays where my presence felt optional, conversations where I was treated as a placeholder rather than a person. By the time I finished college, I knew I couldn't stay. I needed a place where a last name didn't determine my worth. That place turned out to be Idaho. I chose it almost by accident, a job opening a city I'd never visited, a chance that felt like fresh air. I moved to Boise, wondering if distance could really reshape a life. And beneath that question was another heavier one. If I left Charleston behind, would I finally get to exist as myself instead of as Brielle's shadow? That question followed me all the way across the country, setting the stage for the life that would eventually bring me to the truth I'm about to share. Boise didn't look like freedom when I first arrived. It felt unfamiliar, quiet, almost too simple for someone raised in a house obsessed with appearances. But the longer I stayed, the more that simplicity felt like oxygen. People didn't ask about my family name. They didn't care what school I went to. They cared whether I showed up, did the work, and treated people decently. It was new terrain for me. My work as an environmental data analyst wasn't glamorous, but it gave me something I'd never had before. Mornings that began in silence instead of chaos. I'd bike to the lab, sip bitter coffee, and lose myself in patterns, numbers, and rivers on screens. Watersheds made more sense than my own upbringing ever had. And then I met Ava. She was the kind of person who didn't rush to fill silence. During my first week at the lab, she introduced herself with a calm smile, asked me what drew me to Idaho, and actually waited for the answer. There was something grounding about her, steady, kind, observant, in a way that didn't make me feel watched but understood. When she invited me to dinner with her family one Friday night, I expected polite conversation and quick goodbyes. Instead, I walked into a house that felt nothing like Charleston. Ava's parents hugged me longer than my own ever had. They asked what I did, what I enjoyed, what I wanted out of my life, not because they needed it for gossip or image, but because they cared. I sat at their wooden tables surrounded by mismatched plates and real laughter, and felt something loosen inside me. It was the first time I realized how differently love could look when it wasn't tethered to expectations. But even freedom has shadows. One evening, my phone lit up with my mother's name. For a moment, stupidly, my heart lifted. Maybe she missed me. Maybe she was finally calling to ask how I was adjusting. Instead, her voice came sharp and rushed, asking if I could write Brielle's engagement speech, because your sister needs something heartfelt and you're good with words. Not a single question about my life. Not a single acknowledgement that I'd moved across the country. When I hesitated, telling her I wasn't sure I could fly back for the event, I heard voices in the background, crystal glasses, clinking laughter, preparations for Brielle's big moment. And then faintly Brielle's voice cutting through like a blade. Michael doesn't need to come. He'll throw off the lineup. My mother tried to cover the phone, but I'd already heard enough. The role I had been assigned in Charleston hadn't changed. I was still the extra piece, the expendable one, the person whose absence improved the picture. That night after the call ended, I sat on the edge of my bed in my small Boise apartment and felt something shift. A quiet, solid realization: if my family didn't need me at their celebrations, I didn't need to show up to be dismissed. So I made a decision. I wouldn't return to Charleston for Brielle's engagement. I wouldn't rehearse a speech that would be read in a room where I wasn't wanted. Instead, I began to think about what it might look like to build something of my own. A life. A partnership. A family defined not by image, but by sincerity. And almost without meaning to, I started imagining that future with Ava. The night I proposed to Ava in Coeur d'Alene still feels unreal to me, like it belonged to someone braver, someone who believed he deserved to be chosen. The lake was covered in a thin layer of fog, drifting across the surface like a curtain waiting to lift. I didn't plan a speech. I didn't kneel on cue or orchestrate a perfect moment. I just held her hand, felt the warmth of it in the cold morning air, and said that my life had finally started making sense the day she stepped into it. She laughed softly, touched my shoulder, and said yes before I even finished the question. There was no spotlight, no staged photo, no curated audience. And for the first time, I wasn't a background character in my own story. We decided almost immediately that the wedding would be small, nothing ornate, nothing tailored for social approval. Just the two of us, a few close friends, and the families we believed cared enough to show up. Even then, part of me held on to the hope that the Holt family might come. Not because they'd earned the invitation, but because I still wanted to believe there was something salvageable beneath all the years of imbalance. I wanted them to witness a moment that belonged to me. I spent hours designing the invitations. I chose thick cream paper, the kind that feels like a promise when you hold it. I hand-lettered every envelope, making sure each curve of ink was steady, unmistakably mine. When I mailed them, I chose priority, with signature required. After years of my document somehow vanishing in that house, I wasn't taking chances. I wanted confirmation. I wanted certainty. A week later, when I checked the tracking numbers, all 4 invitations had been delivered. All 4 were signed for. The signature was the same each time: Brielle H. Seeing her name didn't shock me immediately. She'd always handled the mail, the schedules, the details in my parents' home. For a moment, I told myself she must have signed for them and set them aside with every intention of passing them along. I let myself believe that. I needed to believe it. The wedding day was quiet and beautiful, the kind of beauty that doesn't need witnesses. The fog returned that morning, settling around the chapel like it remembered us. Our vows were simple, unpolished, honest, in a way my childhood home never allowed. But when the ceremony ended and our small circle of guests gathered around us, I kept glancing toward the empty seats we'd reserved for my family. I checked my phone every hour for a message, any message at all. Nothing came. Not that day. Not the next. Not ever. By the end of the week, I'd convinced myself that maybe they were busy, maybe they were hurt, I hadn't told them sooner, maybe something had gotten lost. But then one afternoon, as I scrolled through my phone, I realized the group chat, our family's main thread for years, no longer displayed my name. I hadn't been announced as removed. I hadn't been confronted or questioned. I had simply vanished from it, erased as quietly as I had existed in that house. Ava noticed the shift in me before I said anything. She sat beside me, resting her hand lightly on my knee, and asked the question I had been avoiding. "Are you sure they got the invitations?" For the first time since the delivery confirmation appeared in my inbox, I felt a cold unease gather behind my ribs. I wanted to brush it off, but something in her eyes, steady, gentle, honest, made it impossible. That was the moment I knew the silence wasn't an oversight. It was intentional, and the only way forward was to trace it back to its source. I opened my laptop that night and typed in the tracking numbers again, unsure what I expected to find. But what I saw was exactly what I'd seen before, 4 signatures, all hers. It wasn't definitive, not yet. But it was enough to plant the seed that something larger was happening, something I could no longer rationalize or excuse. I didn't know the full story then, but I knew this was the point where the quiet stopped feeling accidental. It felt designed. And that realization drew a line between everything I'd been taught to accept and everything I was about to uncover. The week after the wedding should have been all celebration, new routines, new memories, the quiet joy of knowing you've chosen the right person. And it was mostly. Ava filled the apartment with flowers, laughter, and the warm steadiness she carried everywhere. But underneath all of that, there was something hollow in me, a small, persistent ache. I kept checking my phone even when I knew no message was coming. I kept expecting that one of them, my mother, my father, even Brielle, would break the silence and acknowledge the fact that I had crossed a threshold in my life. But nothing came. Ava never pushed, but I saw the worry in her eyes each time I hesitated before unlocking my phone. One evening, as I sat staring at the signatures on the tracking page, she spoke softly, asking if I wanted to look again, really look. I resisted at first. Part of me still wanted to protect the family I'd spent years excusing. But another part, the part that finally recognized the cost of that loyalty, knew she was right. I reopened the USPS site and entered the tracking numbers again. There was no mistake. The same line appeared 4 times delivered, signed by Brielle H. Seeing it again didn't give me clarity. It gave me dread. My mind drifted back to the times when my scholarship packet never reached me until it was almost too late, or when my college admission letters arrived bent and opened despite being sent sealed. Each time I'd assumed I'd written the wrong address or something went wrong in transit. But maybe it hadn't been an accident. Maybe the person controlling the flow of information in that house had always chosen what I was allowed to receive. Ava asked if there had been any email communication as well, so I logged into the account tied to my wedding announcements. There in the activity log was a time-stamped detail I couldn't ignore. The announcement email had been opened in Charleston. Minutes later, it had been deleted. Permanently. The device listed wasn't random. It was the same type Brielle used, the same model, the same operating system. And the deletion had occurred on the same afternoon she posted a photo in her bridal gown, smiling under studio lights. My stomach tightened. It wasn't proof of intent, not yet, but the timing was too precise to ignore. I called my father the next morning, hoping for something clarity, reassurance, anything that made sense. His voice was warm at first, asking about Idaho, the weather, the new apartment. But when I mentioned the wedding invitations, he fell silent. Then he said the sentence that settled everything into place: Brielle handles all the mail's son. She didn't mention anything from you. He didn't sound malicious. Just resigned, as if this arrangement had always been normal. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet of our living room and felt something inside me shift. The narrative I'd defended my whole life, maybe they forgot, maybe it was lost, maybe they didn't mean it no longer held. The evidence sat in front of me in printed form: delivery signatures, email logs, timestamps. Facts, not feelings. I began printing everything. Each page felt heavier than the last. I stacked them neatly in a folder the way you'd prepare documents for a meeting that might change the trajectory of your life. Ava watched me without interrupting. She knew this wasn't just about a wedding. It was about years of swallowed disappointment, years of pretending everything was fine, years of believing that if I showed up quietly enough, patiently enough, they would eventually see me. But the truth was right there, ink on paper. Someone had made sure my wedding never reached my parents. Someone had made sure the day that meant everything to me meant nothing to them. And for the first time, I couldn't reason my way out of the answer forming in my mind. Something was deeply wrong in that house, and it was time for me to uncover all of it. The night Ava and I finally laid every piece of evidence on the kitchen table, the apartment went quieter than I'd ever heard it. Pages that should have been harmless tracking numbers, scanned signatures, email logs suddenly felt like pieces of a puzzle I'd spent my whole life avoiding. Ava sat across from me, her fingers lightly touching the corner of one printout, as if she could feel the weight of everything inside it. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she lifted her eyes to mine and asked almost gently, "Do you think this is the first time she's done something like this?" The question hit harder than anything I'd uncovered on the screen, because deep down I already knew the answer. My mind didn't go to the wedding first. It went years back to a scholarship application that arrived 3 days late. I lost the original offer because someone claimed the school never responded to my follow-up emails. My mother blamed the postal service for the delay. Then I remembered my college testing packet that had gone missing until the final hour, forcing me to scramble just to register in time. And I remembered my mother laughing it off, saying mail gets lost all the time. Standing there in the kitchen, the truth began forming faster than I could process it. The next morning, I called USPS and asked if they could provide scanned copies of the signatures tied to each delivery. The agent pulled them up and read the name out loud. All 4 were signed by a B. Holt. My heart sank. My father would have written out his full name. My mother would have signed with a flourish. Only Brielle signed with an initial, a habit she'd had since high school because she insisted it looked cleaner. I didn't need the scans to know it was hers. I asked for them anyway, and when they arrived, seeing her looping, self-assured stroke knocked something loose inside me. With that confirmation, everything began to click into place. My wedding was in June. Hers was scheduled for October. A 4-month window where any news, any celebration that wasn't hers could shift even a fraction of attention away from the event she'd been curating for over a year. Every dress fitting, every floral mock-up, every tasting, her entire identity had revolved around that wedding. It wasn't hard to imagine her deciding that my wedding didn't fit into that narrative. I didn't want to believe spite could go that deep. But a part of me knew I needed to stop interpreting her actions through the lens of how I wished she felt rather than how she behaved. That night, I logged into the old family email account, the one we all used for group announcements. My mother never checked it. My father rarely remembered it existed, and Brielle managed it like it was part of her job. In the drafts folder, I found something she never intended anyone to see: a half-written message worrying about attention being divided and mentioning how another wedding this year could complicate the family's focus. No names, no addresses, but it didn't need either. If there was one thing I understood about my sister, it was how she talked when she thought no one would hear her. Still, I wanted confirmation from someone outside the 4 of us, so I called my aunt in Charleston, casually asking if she'd heard anything from my parents around June. Her answer hollowed me out. She told me Brielle had mentioned that I was thinking about getting married someday but had nothing planned yet. My aunt even apologized for not calling me, saying she didn't want to pressure me if I felt embarrassed about moving too fast. When I asked if my parents said the same thing, she confirmed they had, which meant my wedding hadn't just been hidden. A different story had been planted in its place, one where my silence wasn't their fault, but my own. One where I was inconsiderate. One where I didn't invite them. The narrative had been crafted neatly and repeated consistently. The realization that followed wasn't bright or explosive. It was slow, thick, like tar rising in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't the quirks of a chaotic household. It was control. It was the erasure of my life event to protect the image of someone else's. Thanksgiving was approaching, and for the first time in years I knew I had to go home. Not out of longing or obligation, but because the truth needed a place to land. I gathered every printout, tucked them into a folder, and set it on my nightstand, the weight of it anchoring the decision I'd already made. Ava didn't try to talk me out of it. She just stood beside me, her hand on my back, steadying me the way no one in my childhood home ever had. I knew walking into that house again would change everything. I just didn't know how much. Flying back to Charleston after so many years felt like stepping into a version of myself I thought I'd outgrown. The moment I walked off the plane, I recognized the humid air, the polished floors, the accents that sounded like memories I no longer claimed. Nothing had changed, and yet everything inside me had. I didn't come home for comfort. I came for the truth. No one was waiting for me. My mother sent a quick message that morning saying she was too busy preparing the Thanksgiving table to pick me up. My father said he was running errands. In a different lifetime, that might have hurt. Now it only confirmed what I had already accepted: my marriage hadn't been worth a drive to the airport. Their son returning after years wasn't worth rearranging a schedule. When I pulled into the driveway in my rental car, the house looked exactly the same: white columns, manicured shrubs, a porch light that burned even in daylight. Brielle stepped out the front door the moment I reached the walkway. She was dressed in a gown far too elaborate for the night before Thanksgiving, hair styled like she expected cameras. She widened her eyes in mock surprise and said, "You actually came." The emphasis told me she hadn't planned for this possibility at all. Inside the house had turned into a shrine to her upcoming wedding. Enlarged engagement photos covered the walls, each one meticulously framed. A mannequin stood in the corner of the living room wearing a replica of her gown. Every detail of her future was on display. None of mine existed anywhere in sight. Not even a single candid photo of my wedding, which I'd sent weeks ago and assumed they simply ignored. As I followed the sound of voices into the kitchen, I paused near the pantry and heard Brielle talking on the phone. Her tone was sharp, impatient. "He won't do anything," she said. "Michael never makes a scene. You know that." The certainty in her voice settled into me like ice. She had built an entire identity for me: quiet, compliant, forgettable, and she believed I would live up to it. When I stepped into the dining room, my father looked up from arranging silverware. His face flickered with something like relief. But when my mother glanced over, he stopped mid-step, arms lowering as if he'd almost broken a rule. That tiny hesitation told me more about the dynamic in this house than anything else. Margot and Brielle weren't just the loudest voices, they were the governing ones. While helping carry decorations to the dining room, I opened a storage box and froze. Under a pile of unused napkins and holiday candles lay a familiar cream envelope, my wedding invitation, unopened, buried like something disposable. I turned it over in my hands, recognizing my own writing, the sharp corners of the cardstock I'd chosen so carefully. My name wasn't even smudged. It had never moved from this box. I dug a little deeper and found the box where the household mail was supposed to be sorted. A label covered the front in neat handwriting: "Do not touch. Brielle only." Inside were bills, letters, catalogs, and next to them the rest of my invitations. All unopened, all hidden in a place no one else would think to check. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I placed the envelope back into the box and closed it gently, as if acknowledging a truth that no longer needed to shout to be believed. That night in the room I used to sleep in as a teenager, I opened my folder of evidence and laid it across the bed. Every page confirmed what I had spent years trying not to see. I wasn't returning to Charleston to repair anything. I was returning to set a boundary I should have drawn a long time ago. Thanksgiving would not be a reunion. It would be the reckoning my family had been avoiding for years. Thanksgiving morning felt like stepping onto a stage I never agreed to perform on. As I walked down the stairs, everything was curated with my mother's signature precision: white candles, gold-trimmed plates, centerpieces arranged so perfectly they looked measured. She always believed a flawless table could mask a flawed family. Near the fireplace, Brielle was already posing with her husband, her dress shimmering under the soft lighting. My mother insisted on adjusting herself. She tilted her chin, lifted her shoulder just so, rehearsing the same poses she'd perfected since childhood. I stood for a good 30 seconds in the doorway. No one asked when I'd arrived. No one even glanced long enough to acknowledge it. When we finally took our seats, a strange, weighted silence settled over the table. My mother's eyes swept over me more than once, not with concern, but with a quiet evaluation, as if I were an accessory that didn't quite match her holiday color scheme. Conversation flowed easily around the table, but only in one direction: Brielle's October wedding. October. Her dress. Her venue. Her floral arrangements. The VIP guest list she'd been so honored to curate. Every detail of her life was center stage, and everyone played their part in praising it. Then came the moment I knew was inevitable. My mother stood, raised her glass, and beamed. Brielle's wedding was simply wonderful, she announced, pausing for effect. And now, Michael, when will you have a real ceremony of your own? A soft wave of laughter fluttered across the table. The clink of silverware against plates sounded like applause for a joke I had somehow become. And in that instant, all the quiet years, all the swallowed words, all the erased pieces of myself rose to the surface. I put my fork down. I already did, I said calmly. 6 months ago, in Idaho. Every movement around the table stopped. My father blinked, confused. We never received any invitations, he said, his voice uncertain. I reached under my chair, pulled out the folder I'd brought with me, and set it on the table. The sound it made was louder than I expected. I unlocked my phone, turned the screen toward them, and opened the USPS tracking. All delivered, I said softly. All signed for. By Brielle. The shift in the room was immediate. Brielle's face stiffened, her smile cracking around the edges, fading until nothing was left but blank stillness. My mother looked between us, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the fracture beneath. I continued opening another file. And here's the email log, the announcement I sent. Opened from this house, deleted minutes later, on Brielle's device. This time, eyes didn't widen, they narrowed. Doubt had entered the room. My sister straightened her postured chin, tilting defensively. I don't remember any of that, she said, waving a hand lightly. Maybe you should have told us directly if you actually wanted us there. Her tone, the dismissal, the deflection, it all revealed more than the evidence did. My father turned to her slowly. Did you sign for your brother's mail? He asked. A simple question that carried the weight of a lifetime. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Silence filled in the truth. Then the mask finally cracked. Brielle's voice trembled, then rose with a rawness I had never heard from her. It wasn't fair, she blurted out. My wedding was supposed to be the event of the year. You weren't supposed to distract from it. A hush spread across the table like smoke. Her words weren't just an admission, they were a confession of the hierarchy our family had built around her. My mother jumped in immediately. Brielle is under a lot of pressure, Michael. You're blowing this out of proportion. Your brother doesn't understand what she goes through. But her voice faltered when she saw the looks around the table, our relatives stiff with discomfort. My father sinking into his chair as though absorbing a truth he'd been avoiding for decades. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Instead, I reached into my folder, pulled out the unopened wedding invitation I'd found buried in the box last night, and placed it in the center of the table. My father recognized my handwriting instantly. He swallowed hard. And in that moment, I saw the realization land inside him like a stone. The room felt smaller, tighter, honest in a way it had never been. I looked at each of them, my mother, my father, my sister, people I had spent years contorting myself for trying to fit back into a family that had never made room for me. I'm not losing a family tonight, I said quietly. I'm just finally stopping the performance of pretending I ever had one. I stood. No one moved. No one spoke. No. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that comes when truth leaves no space for illusion. And I walked out. Stepping outside the Holt house didn't feel like an escape. It felt like stepping out of a shadow that had followed me for 30 years. The Charleston night air was cold and sharp, clearing my lungs in a single breath. The porch lights glowed behind me, but they no longer felt like a beacon, just another part of a home that had never really been home. Ava was waiting beside the car. The moment she saw me, she hurried toward me, arms wrapping around my shoulders before a word even left my mouth. She didn't ask what happened, didn't try to fix anything. She held me the way a person does when they know you've survived something long before the moment you're describing. When we returned to Boise, everything felt different in ways I didn't expect. The air seemed softer. The mornings felt lighter. Even the sound of Ava boiling water for coffee felt like a promise that life could be simple and kind and chosen. A few days later, her family invited us over for dinner. Her father asked how work was going. Her mother told me she was glad to have me in the family, not because I married their daughter, but because they liked me, because they saw me. It was the first time I fully understood how powerful it is to be accepted without performance. Then the past reached out one last time. A week after Thanksgiving, I received an email from Brielle, a long one. She apologized, said she was in therapy, said she'd been raised to believe she had to maintain an image that being the center of attention was her responsibility, not her choice. She admitted she'd acted out of fear of losing control, fear of not being special if someone else had a moment of their own. I read every word, and then I closed the email. Not out of anger, but because some things can be acknowledged without reopening the door they came from. My father called a few days later. His voice was softer than I remembered. He told me he'd found another one of my wedding invitations wedged under a stack of old boxes in the garage. He didn't try to defend anyone. He didn't make excuses. He just sounded tired and sad and sorry in a way he didn't know how to articulate. I let him talk, but I also knew he wasn't strong enough to change the system my mother and Brielle had built. Loving him from a distance would have to be enough. My mother never called. Her silence was the clearest message she'd ever sent me, and somehow that clarity didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It felt like closure. Over the weeks that followed, something inside me settled. I stopped checking my phone for messages that wouldn't come. I started feeling present in my own life instead of waiting to be invited into someone else's. I understood finally that family isn't defined by blood or tradition or last names carved into mailboxes. Family is defined by who shows up, who listens, who stays. And I had that with Ava, with her family, with the life we were building brick by brick, choice by choice. One morning, sunlight spilled across our kitchen counter in Boise, turning everything gold. Ava laughed at something on her phone, the kind of laugh that carries warmth through an entire room. Our friends were coming over for dinner later. There was bread rising on the counter, soft music playing, and a feeling in the air that I'd never had growing up. I stood there, coffee in hand, realizing something simple and profound. This time I was in the center of my own story, not behind anyone, not dimmed, not erased. Just finally fully here. And standing there in that golden light, I realized something I wish I'd known years ago. Sometimes walking away isn't failure, it's freedom. It's choosing peace over approval, truth over pretense, and love over performance. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not waiting for an apology that may never come. I'm simply grateful to finally feel like a whole person in a life I chose, surrounded by people who choose me back without conditions. If you've ever carried the weight of being unseen in your own family, I hope my story reminds you that you're allowed to step into the light too. Before you go, if any part of this resonated with you, I'd love to know you're here. Tell me where you're watching from, or just say I hear you. Stories like this feel less heavy when someone listens. And if you'd like more real stories told with honesty and heart, feel free to subscribe. It means more than you know.